If you think layoffs happen because a company is struggling, that's true sometimes, but it's probably the least interesting reason, and it might not be the most common one. The uncomfortable version is that layoffs are usually planned weeks or months ahead, built off a spreadsheet where your career gets reduced to a handful of data points. I've sat near enough to these rooms to watch names get added and removed like entries in a budget. So I want to walk you through what happens behind that closed door, because understanding the mechanism is the only real protection you have. Hey, welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Dre. I spent years inside recruiting and compensation planning, sitting in rooms where headcount decisions got made long before anyone outside those rooms ever heard about them. This channel exists because most people go through their entire career without ever seeing how these systems actually work. And that gap is exactly what leaves people blindsided when it happens to them. So if you want to understand what's happening on the other side of the table, hit subscribe, because this is the kind of thing nobody explains to you on your way out the door. Before we get into how a layoff list actually gets built, it's worth spending a minute on why it gets built in the first place. Because the reason usually says more about your risk than anything you did at your desk. The obvious answer is cost. Payroll is often the largest controllable expense on a company's books. So when a board or leadership team feels pressure to hit a number, headcount tends to be the fastest lever available. Faster than cutting a product line or renegotiating a vendor contract. Then there's strategic drift, where a company shifts direction, a new focus, a new product, a new market, and the people hired for the old version of the business don't always map cleanly onto the new one. This one is worth sitting with, because it's rarely about whether you did your job well. It's about whether your job still exists in the shape the company is becoming. New leadership is another one I'd treat as an early warning sign. When a senior leader comes in 2 or 3 levels above you, they usually want to build something that reflects their own priorities and their own people, not the priorities of whoever was there before them. It doesn't guarantee a layoff, but in a lot of the situations I've seen, one tends to follow within a year or so. Then there's perception. And this is the one that tends to sit uncomfortably once people actually hear it. Sometimes a workforce reduction isn't about need at all. It's about signaling discipline to investors, showing that leadership is willing to make hard calls. It's worth noticing that stock prices often move upward around these announcements, which tells you the intended audience for the decision isn't always the workforce, it's the market. And more recently, a growing reason has been reallocation. Companies reducing headcount specifically to redirect that budget toward new technology or automation investment, effectively funding the replacement with the savings from the removal. There's one more worth naming, and it's the one people tend to find most unfair once they hear it. Cost stacking by tenure. The longer you've been somewhere, the more your salary, your accrued benefits, and your equity have usually grown, which means 2 people doing functionally similar work can carry very different price tags on that spreadsheet. In a purely cost-driven cut, the more expensive name is sometimes the easier one to remove, regardless of experience or track record. This is one of the reasons people over a certain tenure or salary band sometimes feel like loyalty didn't count for much. It's not that it never counts. It's that on a spreadsheet built around a dollar target, seniority can just as easily read as expense. Now, none of this means every layoff is calculated on purpose. Sometimes it really is survival. But once you understand that most of these decisions start with a number and a strategy rather than a grudge or a performance issue, the next part, how the actual list gets built, starts to make a lot more sense. Most people picture layoff decisions as some dramatic meeting where executives argue over individual names. In practice, that's rarely how it unfolds. It usually starts with a data pool, and it's detailed. HR or an analytics team runs a report across every person in the affected area: name, title, department, salary, tenure, bonus structure, benefits costs, performance rating, and current project assignments. Everything that can be quantified gets quantified into a single working document. And that document is what drives everything that follows. At this stage, nobody in that room is really thinking about you as a person. They're looking at a row of data, and your career gets compressed into a couple of cells on a spreadsheet. From there, leadership sets a target, often expressed as a percentage of headcount or a dollar figure in salary and benefits they need to remove from a division. And that number is usually locked in before a single name gets discussed. Next comes what I'd call the assessment phase, and this is the part worth paying close attention to. Sometimes outside consultants, HR partners, or an unrelated senior leader get looped in to evaluate workload across teams. You might get asked to document what you actually do day to day, or get pulled into a conversation framed as a career check-in, where you're asked about your projects, your skills, your background, sometimes even your resume. It may genuinely be well-intentioned in some cases, but functionally, it's often an assessment of whether your role is essential or whether your work could be redistributed elsewhere. If you notice this kind of conversation happening, it doesn't automatically mean something bad is coming, but it may be worth being deliberate about how you describe your workload, rather than downplaying it out of habit or modesty. After that comes a performance and potential review, where your manager or their manager gets asked to rank the team, often through something like a 9-box grid: performance on one axis, future potential on the other, sorting each person into one of 9 categories. Where you land on that grid tends to have real influence on where your name ends up. But here's the nuance worth holding on to. You don't need to be a weak performer to land on a layoff list. Plenty of reductions have very little to do with individual performance and much more to do with perceived potential, perceived replaceability, or simply whether your manager spoke up for you in a room you weren't in. Once that data exists, leadership and HR sit down together with the spreadsheet, the 9-box results, and the cost target, and they work the math until it adds up. This is usually a meeting most employees never know took place, and often your own manager doesn't know it's happening either. By the time it happens, the outcome is largely already shaped by the data that fed into it, which is exactly why accuracy in your own performance records matters more than people assume. Names then get added to a preliminary list, and it's worth sitting with how mechanical this stage really is. In a lot of cases, the people finalizing that list have never met you. They're reacting to your salary, your rating, your tenure, and whatever your manager said about you in a calibration conversation. Before anything gets finalized, there's usually a risk review, where HR and legal look for exposure, checking whether the list disproportionately affects a protected group, age being a common one considered under employment law. This isn't legal advice, just a general pattern worth being aware of. And if you ever have real concerns about how a workplace decision affected you specifically, that's a conversation worth having with an employment attorney in your area, not something to settle from a video. Sometimes names shift on or off the list at this stage, purely to manage that exposure. And here's something that tends to surprise people. Your direct manager is often one of the last to know, sometimes finding out at the same time their team does, and sometimes discovering they're on the list too. The decision gets made above them, without their input, which means assuming your manager is quietly protecting you behind the scenes may be giving them credit for information and authority they never actually had. Then comes the notification, a sudden meeting invite, or lately, just an email. But by the time you're reading it, the decision was made weeks, sometimes months, earlier. Everything before that moment was the actual process. The message itself is just the notification. So if the decision is mostly made before you ever hear about it, the real question becomes what you can actually do before that point. And this is the part that matters most, because understanding a system only helps if it changes how you move inside it. Visibility tends to function as protection. The people hardest to put on one of these lists are usually the ones whose absence would create an immediate, obvious problem. If your work is documented and tied to outcomes leadership actually tracks, removing you creates friction. If your work is invisible, removing you often feels easy by comparison, regardless of how good you actually are at it. That means making sure your results are visible above your direct manager, not in a political sense, just a factual one, so that whoever sits in that calibration conversation has already heard your name in a positive context before they walk into the room. Relationships above your level matter more than most people want to admit, especially once you remember your manager may not even be present when your name comes up. If someone 2 levels up already knows your value, that conversation shifts considerably in your favor. Those annual performance reviews you've been treating as routine paperwork tend to feed directly into this process later. So consistently sitting at meets expectations can leave you more exposed than someone with a clear, documented pattern of exceeding it. Not because you're valued less as a person, but because it's one more data point suggesting you're replaceable. It's also worth trying to get an honest read on where you might sit on that 9-box grid, even without official access to it. Are you getting stretch assignments? Are you included in high visibility projects? If the signals are unclear, it's reasonable to ask your manager directly what it would take to be seen as high potential in your organization. The answer tends to be revealing either way. Keep your own record of accomplishments and metrics, not just for your resume later, but so your manager has something concrete to argue with if your name ever comes up in a room you're not in. They can't advocate for you with nothing in hand. It's also worth paying attention to internal mobility during any period where a reorg or a strategic pivot seems to be underway. Moving into a role that's clearly tied to where the company says it's headed before the reduction happens rather than after can sometimes take you out of the pool being evaluated altogether. Since a role that's fully staffed under the old structure and a role that's actively needed under the new one tend to sit very differently on that spreadsheet. And if you sense something building, resist the urge to quit preemptively. A layoff usually comes with severance and unemployment eligibility. Resigning on your own timeline usually comes with neither, and you'll likely be explaining the gap in interviews either way. Instead, quietly update your resume, warm up your network, and let the company make the first move if it's going to happen. Because that first move is often the difference between leaving with something and leaving with nothing. And if that moment does come, it's worth knowing you're generally not required to sign a severance agreement on the spot. Taking a day or more to actually read what you're agreeing to, and if the number or the terms feel significant, having an employment attorney look it over tends to be one of the more overlooked steps in the entire process, mostly because people are caught off guard and want the moment to be over. So no, layoffs aren't random, and they're often not fair in the way we'd want them to be. But they do follow a process, and a process has a logic you can actually study. The more clearly you understand how that list gets built, the more control you have over whether your name ends up on it. And if it ever does anyway, at least you'll know you did what was actually within your power beforehand. If this helped make sense of something that usually stays hidden until it's too late, subscribe and drop a comment with the part of this that surprised you most, because a lot of people don't realize how far in advance this actually gets decided. And if you want the companion to this one, I've got a video coming on the quiet signs that usually show up before a layoff, the kind that show up in your calendar and your workload months before anyone ever says the word out loud. Appreciate you watching.